Hello everyone and welcome to our virtual Tech Days 2020 at the University of New Mexico. This presentation is everything you want to know about authentication, MFA, and other at UNM, but are afraid to ask. My name is Neil Sabol. I work on the Enterprise Managed Systems and Services team with UNM Information Technologies. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about the authentication landscape at UNM, anywhere from single sign-on to multi-factor authentication, and some of the improvements and changes you can expect to see in the next year. All right, so if you choose to watch this presentation in its entirety, this is what you're getting yourself into. This is our agenda. We're going to first talk about the authentication roadmap in general at UNM. So it's actually 4 parts, so I disguise this a little bit. Really, that's going to end up taking a little bit of the presentation, so it'll be parts 1 through 4, and then we're going to jump into multi-factor authentication, or MFA. We're going to talk about what it is, what our current state is for MFA, which many of you may be familiar with. We're using Duo Security and have been since 2016. We'll talk about the future state of MFA, which will be Azure MFA, Microsoft MFA solution, which is actually a new technology to UNM. We'll talk about the MFA roadmap for the next year or so, because that's actually pretty hammered out compared to the authentication roadmap itself. So we have some specific milestones for MFA in the next year or so. And then I'll just talk through some general Azure MFA usage and tips that you may find valuable. It's worth mentioning this presentation it's good for everyone to see and attend. It's not strictly technical. If you're non-technical, I think there'll be value in you watching this as well. There are a couple of slides we get into the weeds on, but that's okay. If any of this stuff looks intimidating or not interested, you can always just skip ahead. That's the beauty of doing this virtually. So jumping right into the authentication roadmap, I think it's easiest to share with you what our end goal and vision is for this project and for single sign-on and authentication in general. And that end goal is true single sign-on, or true SSO. In short, that's not what we have today, right? And I'll show you, it won't be very quick in this video, but I'm going to show you what that looks like, and then I'll show you what this will look like. But this will basically improve productivity and I think greatly improve the login experience for all users at UNM, students, staff, faculty, anyone that's authenticating to UNM systems. So say it's Monday morning, logging into my workstation. So I went ahead and typed in my username and password, as we all do. So next, maybe I want to go to Lobo Mail, check my email, see what's come in over the weekend. So of course, I'm now prompted to authenticate again. So this is a second login attempt. It's been less than a minute. So I'll go ahead and log into Lobo Mail. Maybe look at my inbox, see what I have. So now I've decided, maybe I want to go to my UNM and see if I can register for a class. So I head over to my UNM in my browser, click login, and I'm prompted to log in again. So this is now the third login in just about a minute. So now authenticated to my UNM, go into Lobo Web, go to the student tab, maybe go to records and registration, start my class registration process. So since I've had to log in 3 times already, maybe my fingers are getting kind of tired, so I need an appointment at Shack. So I go to the Shack Health portal. I'm prompted to log in yet again with my NetID and password, same one. So this is now 4 times that I've typed my NetID and password in the course of just about a minute or so. So as you can see, this is a little bit painful maybe. So next, okay, I have a homework assignment for my CS class. And like a good developer, I'm storing my code in LoboGit. So I go to the LoboGit page. Guess what? I'm logging in again with my NetID and password. That is now the 5th time I've had to type my NetID and password in the course of this. So I'm going to pull up my homework here, maybe commit some changes. Next, maybe I'm going to go to UNM Learn and submit that homework to my instructor. So I'll go to UNM Learn. Guess what? NetID and password login yet again. So this is now the 6th time I've logged in, and it hasn't even been 2 minutes yet. So I'll go ahead and log in to Learn. Of course, I don't have an actual class here, but just pretend I'm submitting my homework as I'm going through this process here. So finally, I've realized, wow, this single sign-on experience is really non-existent, and I'm really tired of typing my password. I'm going to tell IT about this because I really think that this situation should be improved. Sure enough, you're logging into help.unm, username and password, a 7th time. So as you can see, this gets old pretty quick. And what's even more interesting about this is if UNM's maybe the only place you've gone to school, or if it's the only place you've worked, you might consider this to be normal, right? I mean, a lot of people think this is business as usual. This is Monday morning at UNM or any other place you'd work. But let me tell you a secret. That's not true. There are places that you work where you truly log in one time to your workstation and you're automatically authenticated to every subsequent application or service that you access. So you might ask yourself, how did UNM even get into this situation where we have to log in so many times and we have to enter our net IDs and passwords multiple times to access, applications that are all part of UNM's infrastructure? And that's a really good question. So most of the answer is UNM has two underlying directories, four identity providers, and two multi-factor authentication providers. And the issue is these don't talk to each other, right? So when you authenticate to an application that's using, say, ADFS, you might have single sign-on into other applications that are using ADFS, but that's only a subset of applications. Other applications are using CAS, they're using Shibboleth, they might be binding to Active Directory LDAP directly. So none of those other things have any awareness of each other. So when you're typing in your password and being issued an authentication token, that's not shared with these other services and identity providers. So in essence, you're having to get a new token from a different service every time you're authenticating to one of these apps. So that's why you're entering your username and password so many times just to do what are seemingly normal business activities. So as I noted, through SSO, which will be powered by Azure AD, will eventually allow your workstation login to be basically your login, the one login to rule them all, if you will. You'll log into your workstation, and then anything you access in the browser, you'll be authenticated automatically using the credentials that you already supplied. So we're really excited about this, and we think this will be a huge improvement to the login experience and login flow. So to visualize the end state, let's take a look at what true single sign-on could look like. So again, it's Monday morning. I log into my workstation with my net ID and password like I usually would. Okay, awesome. I'm going to have to do that regardless. The difference is I go to Lobomail. Guess what? I don't have to authenticate. It's already done, and it's using my workstation login for authentication via Azure AD. Similarly, my UNM. I go to my UNM. Guess what? I'm already authenticated. CAS authentication is delegated to Azure AD, so I don't have to type my username and password again. Same for the Shack Health portal. Guess what? I just go to the portal. I'm already logged in. I don't need to type credentials again. Similarly with LoboGit, I'm going to go and pull up my homework I worked on before. I don't have to log in. I'm there. Same with Learn. No login prompt. I'm automatically authenticated to Learn. So all this said, maybe I want to now submit another ticket to IT and explain to them how happy I am about, this new single sign-on experience and how well things are working. I go to help.unm, I'm already authenticated and I don't have to log in again. So this is what we're driving towards. And as you can see, I think this is pretty exciting and will save a lot of time. Okay, so I promise this is the last slide on the authentication roadmap. And this one's a little bit nerdy, so if you're not technically inclined or don't care for this type of thing, you can go ahead and skip this slide and skip ahead. But for everyone else, we did mention the one password, one username and password to rule them all, or one login to rule them all. Well, how do we achieve this? We're going to achieve this with using Azure Active Directory as a primary identity provider, or if you will, the one identity provider to rule them all. So instead of having a bunch of separate identity providers with different logins, different tokens, things like that, we're going to tie everything back to one central provider, which will be Azure AD. So here we have Azure Active Directory, and here we have some UNM apps. So there's a couple ways that we're going to do this migration and integration going forward. So the first thing is, if applications can use SAML or use OpenID Connect for authentication directly, it's simply a matter of reconfiguring those applications to use Azure AD. And it's a really quick and painless process. There's actually a slide that we'll go over at the end of this presentation that we'll talk about that process and at least show it from the Azure AD standpoint. So that's obviously the preferred method. If you can tie an application directly into Azure AD, you get the best experience and the most flexibility in terms of single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, etc. So we realize this might not always be possible, right? There are some applications that simply don't support SAML, they don't support OpenID Connect, or there are other reasons they can't use a modern authentication protocol. So we understand that a lot of those are probably using Central Authentication Service or CAS today. And CAS is probably by far our most popular identity provider. I'd wager that probably 95% of our applications use CAS. So, well, what do we do here? Then it looks like we're creating another mess, right? Well, the good news is we're not. So what we can do is those applications that are using CAS remain unchanged, right? They'll continue to use CAS, but what we can then do is modify CAS and delegate its authentication to Azure AD. So what'll happen is a person logs into one of these applications that's using CAS, they'll be quickly directed to the CAS login page, which they won't see. They'll just see the URL in their browser, and then CAS will then redirect to Azure AD. Azure AD will complete the authentication if they haven't already, send the token back down to CAS, which will be translated into a token for the application. So there's, again, no login prompt. It's really just CAS kind of serving as an authentication proxy, if you will, to proxy CAS to SAML, and then from SAML back to CAS for the application that's consuming that token. So of course there are other scenarios. What about applications that don't use CAS at all and can't use Azure AD for other reasons? So for that, we can use F5 Access Policy Manager. And this is, of course, dependent on whether the app is behind the F5 or not. So there's a little bit of dependency there. But what we can do in that case is use F5 Access Policy Manager, delegate the F5 authentication to Azure AD. So this is basically the same thing as CAS, except instead of delegating the CAS authentication to Azure AD, we're delegating the F5 authentication to Azure AD. So again, then F5 kind of serves as this proxy where, it's SAML authentication being delegated from the F5 to Azure AD. When that response comes back, the F5 is just translating that into whatever authentication the client application needs to be able to consume. So again, this was a little bit on the nerdy side, but just to kind of show the three ways that we plan to move forward with this, in case you had questions about the backend stuff. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So most of you are probably familiar with this, right? If you've used Facebook, if you've used Gmail, Google services, if you've done online banking in the last decade or so, you've probably been exposed to multi-factor authentication, whether you know it as that or not. It's based on the premise of something you know, which is your username and password, in addition to something you have, which is a device, whether it be a phone or a tablet or a computer. It's basically something else. And the idea is that if someone compromises your credentials somehow, your username and password, if they have those, chances are they're not going to also have your phone with them, right? So we see a lot of hacking attempts originating from other parts of the world. That's where a lot of the phishing originates, and that's where a lot of our compromised accounts are logged into from after they're compromised. So as long as you don't have your phone across the world and you have your phone with you, requiring that as part of the authentication process makes your account astronomically more secure, because even if you do get compromised first factor, as long as you don't accept the authentication prompt on your device or answer the phone call and affirm that you're logging in, the malicious user won't be able to access your account, which is a great protection for you and for UNM in general. Okay, so let's take a look at a practical example of multi-factor authentication. I personally think this is easier to visualize and see than it is to explain. So we'll walk through a quick example here that involves our own Lobo Lucy and our adversary Pistol Pete, the NMSU Aggie. So again, we're Lucy Lobo, say we want to access a UNM application. So regardless of what we're accessing, we're always going to have to log in with our first factor, right? Which is our username and password, or our NetID and password. So the issue is, what if someone else compromises that or has that? Whether they guessed it, whether they brute forced it, whether they phished it. Somehow, let's assume that, Pistol Pete, our friend from NMSU, also has Lucy Lobo's NetID and password, which is an unfortunate situation, but believe it or not, this happens pretty frequently. So they log into the application. So unfortunately, they're both able to log in because they both know the NetID and password for Lucy Lobo, which is unfortunate. That's because, Pete, being the Aggie that he is, he stole it. It's obviously not ideal. But here's where the magic of MFA comes in. So the second factor will trigger at that point, and we'll assume that Lucy Lobo set up her personal cell phone as her second factor, which is what we recommend people do. And this is where the differentiator comes in, right? So Lucy will get the authentication prompt on her phone after she's logged in with first factor saying, do you want to allow this authentication attempt? She can answer yes, and she's authenticated the UNM app. And this is a differentiator for Pete, right? So he's not going to have Lucy's phone with him. Only Lucy's going to have that. So he's unable to complete that second factor prompt, and he's not going to be able to access the application, despite the fact that her first factor is compromised. Now, what's interesting is Lucy would see on her phone this second weird authentication attempt coming from Pistol Pete. But that's, again, a good indicator that your account is compromised, and she could then report that to the UNM IT service desk and get that straightened out. And that's really just a matter of then resetting your NetID password so that your adversary no longer knows it. So this is how multi-factor authentication works in practice. UNM is no stranger to multi-factor authentication. So back in 2016, we did roll out Duo Security for very specific Lobo web modules. So if you're an employee or have otherwise been paid by UNM in some capacity, you've probably seen this in action, right? If you log into Lobo Web and update your direct deposit allocation or accounts, you're prompted for multi-factor authentication. Since 2016, it's been applied to other modules in Lobo Web that generally contain sensitive information like benefits, W2, W4, etc. So why did we do this? There are two reasons that are very closely related. So this all started back in, I believe, 2014-ish, when there was a breach of the direct deposit module in Lobo Web. At that time, the module didn't require two-factor. It was a single-factor login. So you'd log in with your NetID and password. You could go in and update your direct deposit accounts. No need for multi-factor, no need for anything else. What happened was malicious users who compromised UNM users' first-factor credentials, their NetIDs and passwords, actually logged into Lobo Web on those users' behalf, went into the direct deposit module on those users' behalf, removed the real users' direct deposit accounts, and added their own malicious direct deposit accounts. And in doing that, they're actually able to redirect employees' paychecks to themselves for monetary gain. So when that occurred, I think again that was 2014-ish. I might be making that up, but someone will have to fact check that one. So when that occurred, basically we didn't have Duo implemented yet. So the solution was to just take the direct deposit module offline in Lobo Web and prevent changes to direct deposit information. It required an in-person visit to the payroll office at that point, paper form. There's no way you could do it online. So when Duo was applied to that, it restored the convenience of being able to do it online, and it also improved the security of being able to do it. Because at that point, if that same scenario recurred, which is, the user account gets compromised, someone logs into LoboWeb on their behalf, they can't complete the login and they can't get access to direct deposit because they're not going to have the user's multi-factor device to complete the process. So I think that Duo was great, and it did definitely bring the convenience of bringing the direct deposit change back online versus in person, and it definitely improved the security of that. I don't think there have been any instances of redirected paychecks since this has been implemented. So for all the good Duo has done, there are definitely some interesting trends in the data, and there have definitely always been some shortcomings with the solution. And we'll talk about how we're going to address those with Azure MFA in the next slide. But just to work through some of this stuff. So when Duo was implemented, we didn't offer Duo Push as an authentication option, right? So that would be a little notification on your phone that you click approve or deny on to, allow or disallow a login. We only enabled it for phone call and SMS, and then we subsequently enabled the remember device functionality. So based on that, what we found over time is about 65% of authentications are completed via phone call, 27% are with an SMS, and 8% are other. And that other includes things like remember devices, hardware tokens. There's a couple of those out there. And there may be a couple of, like recovery passcodes, things of that nature that are rolled into it. So it's very phone call heavy is the long and short of that. And to that end, Duo has an authentication cost per authentication, right? So each phone call or each SMS message that Duo sends costs us a little bit of money. So a little bit of money done a bunch of times over a period of time adds up. So looking at the data historically, it's about $10 a day for telephony for authentication with Duo. It doesn't sound like a lot, right? But if you multiply that by 365 days, you're getting into the mid, $3,500, $3,000 range at that point. So it's definitely one where it adds up over time. And we'll talk about how Azure MFA solves for some of that in the subsequent slides. So authentication failure rate with Duo, it's about 10% for phone calls and 20% for SMS. And we think this is probably because the SMS functionality in Duo is not super intuitive. I mean, it's okay and people figure it out, but if twice as many people are failing that way than they are with phone call, it seems to suggest to us that there's something a little bit wonky with how that is implemented. So that's another thing that Azure MFA irons out a little. And it is worth noting, so we pay failed authentication or not, we pay for it, right? So in that $10, that includes failed authentication attempts. So and then the top causes for authentication failures, these are interesting, and these highlight, I think, probably some of the one of the most visible issues with Duo today. So the most common causes are user not in permitted group and invalid passcode. So that user not in permitted group is a very generic error message for the delay caused with our 48-hour provisioning process. So if you didn't realize this, if you've worked at UNM for a while, maybe you didn't experience this. If you started in the last couple of years, you may have realized that it takes at least 2 full days before you can actually authenticate via Duo or get into LoboWeb, set up your direct deposit from the time that your NetID is created. And this is substantially longer than the provisioning for our other services. So this has been a huge pain point. Up to the SVP level, this is something that we've been asked to address. And so we will be addressing this with Azure MFA, which is great news. And then going back to the SMS passcode stuff, a valid passcode, that just means that, the passcode provided was not correct. And I suspect this is related to that 20% failure rate for SMS passcodes. It's just because that functionality in Duo is not super intuitive. There's, the click stream for it's, 5 clicks longer than it needs to be. It's a little bit cumbersome. So my speculation is that's why we're having so many of those issues. And that's about 50% probably of the failures, just those two. So in terms of future state, Azure MFA will become the multi-factor authentication provider for the University of New Mexico. And you might ask, well, why? Why are we doing this? We already have Duo. Why not just grow that or do something different? And that's a very good question. There's a couple of reasons that we're looking at doing this, and these are in no particular order. Maybe they're in a sort of particular order, but the first and foremost, and I think this is the most important thing, is this moving to Azure MFA eliminates the 48-hour provisioning delay for new users. This gets it down more in line with what it is for provisioning Office 365 or LoboMail. I think we advertise that as 4 hours, but really it's more like 1 hour, depending on how things go. So we're really excited about that. It'll allow new employees, new students to get started literally right away and not have that 2-day delay that they're experiencing now for things that require MFA, which is a little bit painful. In addition, we talked about Azure AD in some of the earlier slides. Azure MFA is really just an extension of Azure AD. So putting the stake in the ground for MFA and putting that stake into Azure AD helps kind of pin down Azure AD as the primary authentication provider down the road. So it lays the groundwork for true SSO. And it's a great first step. Once we have the MFA piece done, then we can move back to doing the first factor in Azure AD, which is an easier process. Additionally, Azure MFA, in my opinion, enhances the user experience in many ways. There are more MFA options. So instead of just call and text like we have for Duo, you can use the Microsoft Authenticator app, which supports push notifications. You can just tap approve or deny on your phone to accept authentication attempts. The SMS experience just works, right? It's a lot more intuitive, I think, than the Duo experience. There's no click stream. You just select your phone, click next, it sends the text, enter the code, you're done. I mean, it just works the way you'd expect a SMS authentication to work. And lastly, the Remember Me experience, I think, is a little bit better. So with Duo, it's capped. I think it's like 7 or 14 days, and it's not very highly used, as you saw. I think it was only 8% of authentications use that. So with Azure MFA, the Remember Me, your trusted device functionality is enhanced. It'll technically let you remember or trust a device for 180 days or whatever the interval is between password changes, which makes the experience a lot smoother, in my opinion. And then these last three, these are more back-end IT-like things. So as a student, faculty, or staff, you may not care so much for these, but I figured I'd throw these in. So Azure MFA, all the logging is done in Azure AD. So we have a centralized location for logs for both first and second factor authentications, which is great because it's easier for us to spot compromised accounts and deal with issues like that versus looking across a bunch of different providers. So that's a win for IT, the nerds like Neil. And then granular conditions to trigger MFA only in some scenarios. So this is actually a cool thing as well. It'll let us, if depending on the sensitivity of the data and the application, it'll allow us to enforce MFA only if it's truly required. So there may be some applications that require MFA from off campus, but not on campus, or scenarios like that. Or there may be some devices or platforms we trust and others that we don't. So we'll only require MFA in those situations. This is a great thing. It helps us make the MFA experience a little less intrusive for folks. So we're pretty excited about this as well. And then finally, last, definitely not least, so reduce costs. Azure MFA doesn't have any any ongoing telephony charges at all. So it's not a situation where you pay for each phone call or each text like it is for Duo. So that virtually eliminates that $10 per day charge we talked about with Duo. That's gone. So what we pay for Azure MFA is just a flat rate, regardless of the utilization. There's no change. And if someone authenticates 500 times in a day, well, that's great. They can do that. There's no additional cost to UNM, which also makes us happy. Okay, so let's talk about the MFA roadmap for the rest of this year and 2021. So the first thing we're starting with, and I think I mentioned this, is kind of the soft rollout of Azure MFA, will be TouchNet or Bursar Account Suite, and that'll be in May 2020. And again, the background on this is very similar to the direct deposit for employees issue. So what was happening is there was malicious redirection of students' financial awards, scholarships, and grants using TouchNet because attackers have discovered that they can go into TouchNet, add a direct deposit account to a student's account that's not theirs, and then redirect funds that would otherwise be intended for the student into their own malicious account. So that'll be the soft rollout. We expect that to happen in May 2020. And this is actually a major milestone because you may have read between the lines, Duo was actually never applied to anyone except for employees, so people that got paid. That would be student employees, staff, faculty, etc. This TouchNet rollout actually brings a larger population into the mix, which is students. So this will be, I think, an interesting thing, and it's a great way to get started with Azure MFA. Once that's done, we're targeting June 2020 to move everything that's using Duo today to Azure MFA. So again, that's Global Web Direct Deposit, benefits, W2, W4. And that's basically just going to be a sort of drop-in replacement, and then this will affect another population, which will be, the faculty and staff and student employees that have used Duo previously for pay-related things. Those will be the users that are pulled in at that point, if they weren't already pulled in as part of the TouchNet rollout. And then lastly, hopefully by the end of this year, 2020, we'll be applying Azure multifactor authentication to Office 365. And this will hugely reduce the amount of spam and phishing issues we see. So I've noted some very painful subject lines from emails down at the bottom there. Notices, rely, assistant intern. I'm sure those bring back some horrific memories for some people from the fall 2019 semester and early spring 2020 semester. So like a lot of those weird messages you get from UNM people are a result of compromised accounts. So applying multi-factor authentication to Office 365 will basically eliminate that. So you might still get spam externally, but it'll hugely reduce the number of phishing and spam attempts that originate from actual UNM accounts, which is really great news. And just as a disclaimer, before I go to the next slide, so of course, you put this stuff in a presentation, talk about it. These dates are subject to change, right? So I mean, these are ideal and these are true as of April 30th, 2020. But as you all know, things change at UNM very quickly, so this might be completely different dates next week or after that. So this is the intended target. I hope this is a timeline we stick to, but there are no guarantees. Okay, so that brings us into the demo part of this presentation. So I'm going to walk you through some different scenarios with Azure MFA just to kind of show you what you can expect when this is rolled out. The first thing we're going to show is initial enrollment. This is something you'll only have to do one time, and it's something that'll be triggered from the IT side or from our side. So you may not see this right away, but when you will see it is when we actually apply MFA to your account in an application that you're using the first time you log into that application after we've made the policy change on our side. This is the process that you'll see. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to use Lobomail in this example, so we'll go ahead and go to the Lobomail login page here, and we'll log in normally, right? So this all looks pretty normal from the get-go. What's going to be different is there'll be a more information required screen after your initial login. And that's what that looks like. So if you see this screen, that means that we've applied the MFA policy to your account and or the application you're logging into. So this is where you perform the initial enrollment. By default, the Microsoft Authenticator app is selected, and that's what we prefer and recommend that you use. You can choose a different method if you want to, but that's probably more for advanced users. So we'll stick with the Authenticator app for this demo. So you click Next. You'd want to download and install the Microsoft Authenticator app on your device. I've already done so, so it's a view of my device over there on the right. So you want to go ahead and launch the Authenticator app. And then you'll add a new account. You'll choose work or school account. Then you'll just scan this QR code. You might need to grant the app permission to do that. So if it asks, go ahead and give it permission. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So then you'll want to do next. And then the next step is Microsoft verifies that the connection was created successfully and everything's working. So you should get a push notification on your device. Go ahead and do approve on that, and perfect. So everything's working. So that's all there is to the enrollment process, basically. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It tends to work pretty well. And again, we want to recommend that you use the Microsoft Authenticator app with push notifications. And there we have it. We're all logged into LoboMail and good to go. So going forward, I can now use that MFA device for two-factor authentication whenever needed. So next, let's look at the ongoing authentication experience with Azure MFA. So after you've done the initial enrollment, this is something that you'd see basically for subsequent login attempts for applications that require MFA. So we're going to use LoboMail for this example again. So the first thing you would do is obviously navigate to the LoboMail URL. I mean, this could be any application. It doesn't have to be LoboMail. You would log in with your first factor, your NetID, and your password. And now injected into the login process is this multi-factor authentication prompt. So this is where on your device you'll get a little push notification. You can choose approve or deny. Go ahead and approve that, and we'll go ahead and log into LoboMail. And so that's really all there is to it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I think the push notification is pretty frictionless. Again, that's why we sort of recommend that approach. You can do phone call, you can do text message. There's some other options there as well. In my opinion, those are a little, cause a little more friction. For the text message, you have to actually transcribe the code from your device and type it into the computer, the window on the computer to authenticate. Yeah, it's a little bit cumbersome. Phone call, it takes a little while to receive the call and listen to the message, and then I think it's press 0 or pound to acknowledge it. So push notifications, I think, are the way to go. You may not see this all the time, so we'll talk about remember devices in one of the next slides here. So if you've used that option, you might not see that MFA prompt every time. You won't have to go through that process. And additionally, there may be some applications that, depending on the sensitivity of the data, only require MFA sometimes under certain circumstances. But in general, this is what you can expect to see with ongoing authentication with Azure MFA. Okay, so now let's take a look at the beauty of multi-factor authentication. We can watch it in action as we actually stop a hacking attempt. So this might happen if your first factor, your NetID and password are compromised. And usually a hacking attempt of this nature will manifest itself as just a random push notification on your device when you're not really expecting it. You're not trying to log in, you're not trying to do anything, but you're on your device and you get this weird authentication prompt asking you to confirm an authentication. So let's take a look at that. So it comes in. If you get one of these and you're not trying to log in, you just do deny. You get sign in denied there. So it's as easy as that. Once you've done that, the attacker is going to be unable to log into your account. It is a good indicator to you, though, that there's probably something amiss. I mean, it's very likely that your NetID and password are compromised. So at that point, you should probably call the service desk and reset your first factor, your NetID and password. Or if you can do it yourself, you can always go to netid.unm.edu and do that. But that's where this really shines, right? Because technically you're going to have your phone with you probably at all times. It's very unlikely that a malicious user or an attacker is going to have your phone. So that's where this really shines and helps prevent damages to UNM and to your account from compromised credentials. Okay, so next let's take a look at the Remember Me for Trusted Device functionality in Azure MFA. So I've alluded to that on and off throughout this presentation, so now let's actually see that in action. This is something that you would use on, your personal device that's, securely at home, or some other device that you have full trust for, that it's unlikely to be stolen, it's not a shared or community device that other people have access to. And this basically suppresses the authentication prompt going forward for MFA until you reset your password. So let's take a look at that process. We're going to use LoboMail again. So we'll go ahead and log into LoboMail with our first factor, our NetID, and our password. And once we've done that, we'll get, of course, the multi-factor authentication prompt. So we'll go ahead and approve that notification on our device. And after we've done so, the next window you see will be this, reduce the number of times asked to sign in here. So on this, if you click yes, this will basically activate kind of the trusted or remember me functionality for devices. So let's go ahead and close out our browser. Go ahead and open it back up. So normally we'd have to re-authenticate to LoboMail, right? So let's go to the LoboMail URL. And as you can see, since we've changed that setting, we're now taken directly into Global Mail, and we don't need to perform either first factor or second factor authentication. So this is a time saver. It's very valuable for, personal secure devices. You'd obviously never want to do this on a public device or a device that's not just yours, basically, right? Because that exposes you to a little bit of risk there if you're remembering your credentials on a shared or a public device. So this is something that we recommend you use if you don't want to do multi-factor all the time and the device that you're using this option on is considered to be secure. So I think this is another thing that really helps reduce some of the friction around multi-factor authentication, and I think it should be a helpful thing for most folks. Okay, so I apologize in advance for the length of this one. This is a little bit of a lengthy demo, but what I'm going to show you here is how you can use Azure MFA if you either do not have a phone or a device or prefer not to use one. So what's neat about Azure MFA is it supports what we call OAuth time-based one-time passwords, and that's the time-based factor. Basically, it's a kind of neat one-time password-based algorithm that has really no dependency on internet connectivity, no dependency on specific devices, etc. So we're going to go ahead and walk through the setup process here. And I think the best approach here is to use the extension for Chrome. So this will work across devices, right? So you'll go to your Chrome extensions, search for Authenticator basically, and we're going to use the Authenticator extension that's offered by authenticator.cc. So you go ahead and add this to Chrome. And you can do this on a Chromebook, on Chrome on Mac, Chrome on Windows. That's why I kind of like this, is it really works across platforms. You can do Chrome on Android, however you want to do it. So there we go. The Authenticator extension has been installed in Chrome. So go ahead and go back here, and you can see it's now available in Chrome there. That's what Authenticator looks like. So now let's go through the process of actually adding this as a multi-factor authentication method to our Azure MFA account. So you can go to aka.ms/MFA setup if you want to change, add, or remove devices after the fact. Since I already registered initially or enrolled, that's what we're going to do. So you can log in with your first factor when you're going to that portal. You can go ahead and choose yes or no on this accordingly. We discussed that before. Anytime you're making changes to your multi-factor setup, you have to authenticate with one of your existing second factors. So that's what we'll do here. Again, choose yes or no here accordingly. So basically what you're going to see now is a similar portal to what you saw whenever you initially enrolled in Azure MFA. But what you'll see is there's an option to add a new method here. So we'll go ahead and do that. Again, these are the options you have. We'll go ahead and use Authenticator app. So by default, this uses Microsoft Authenticator because that's the preferred method. But what you can do is use this link to select a different Authenticator app. So you want to go ahead and install the app or the extension, which we did. So that's there in Chrome. Most of these Authenticator apps and add-ons will have an option to scan a QR code. So if you can do that, it's highly recommended. Otherwise, you have to manually type in the code, which is painful. So we'll go ahead and use that functionality. We'll scan the QR code on the screen. And there we have it. Now my account's added to this Authenticator extension. So next we're going to have to validate it to make sure that things are working properly. So if you double click, you can actually copy the code in there. And I actually made a mistake here, so this is probably going to fail. That's, as you can see, that code didn't match what was displayed in the window. So we'll go ahead and copy that again, paste it in there, do next. And after a couple moments here, it should validate, and we'll get this Authenticator extension linked as one of our multi-factor authentication methods in our account. So again, it doesn't have to be this Chrome extension. I think this is kind of not a bad idea because it does work in anywhere that you're running Google Chrome basically, which is across devices and platforms. There are obviously device-specific apps you can run. There's Google Authenticator for tablets and mobile devices. There are standalone Authenticator apps for Windows and Mac. But anyway, this is what we're going to go over for this one. So now go ahead and log in and let's test this out. So we'll log into Global Mail with our first factor, NetID and password. And so my default method was the push notification, but let's go ahead and use the verification code from the app instead. So now we'll go ahead and go in here and copy out that OAuth TOTP code, paste it in, verify, and as you can see, I'm now successfully authenticated using this Chrome extension, which is it's basically a little standalone OAuth time-based one-time password app. So, I mean, this is, as you can see, this is a little bit involved. It's not not a super frictionless experience. It takes a little bit of doing and a little bit of rigmarole to get going. So I'd only recommend doing this if you really don't have a phone, you really are adamant about not using your phone for MFA, or that you have some other situation where just using your mobile device and the Microsoft Authenticator app with push notifications is not an option. So anyway, that's what that process looks like. It's possible, not frictionless by any means, but it's something you can do with Azure MFA, which is pretty slick. So hopefully with all this talk about MFA, you're now all excited and riled up and really want to get in and try this out. So we hope you're there with us. If not, that's okay too. But in this demo, I'm going to show you how you can actually voluntarily opt into the MFA pilot for Office 365. So this is available to anyone, staff, students, faculty, etc. And you can do this anytime. Part of the beauty is you can opt in and you can also opt out if you don't like it or have issues for whatever reason. So you might not be able to do that forever, right? This is more of just a preview of what's coming. As you saw in that roadmap, Office 365, we hope to apply MFA by the end of this year, maybe early 2021. So the opt-in, the ability to opt out, that might be temporary. This might be a forced thing at some point in the future. So let's take a look at this process. So what you can do is go to myapps.microsoft.com. This will take you to your access panel. So go ahead and go to groups, and go to join group. And then here just search for UNM multifactor or UNM multi, something to refine the results. Go ahead and select the UNM multifactor authentication group and go ahead and click join group. So for business justification, I mean, you can put whatever you want in here. I mean, you can put just trying this out. I'm interested in MFA. I want to secure my account, just something to that effect. And go ahead and do request. And this is actually all automatic on the back end. So in a minute or so, you'll be auto approved, as you can see here. And go ahead and click OK. So once you've done this, basically within, I want to say 15 minutes or so, MFA will be applied to your account for the Office 365 applications. So that would be things like Teams, Lobomail, SharePoint, things of that nature. Basically anything you're accessing in the UNM Office 365 suite or through Lobomail will start to require multi-factor authentication. And for Lobomail, this is actually one of the things we did conditionally. So when you do this, it shouldn't really have any effect on your mobile device, right? So you won't have to do multi-factor if you've set up your email on your phone, you put Lobomail on your phone using either the built-in mail client, or if you've done anything like that, that shouldn't really have any effect on your phone. But what you will see is when you're logging into Lobomail through a browser, or when you're launching the Outlook client on a machine that's off the UNM network, that's when you'll see the multi-factor for Office 365 kick in. One of the other conditions is location, right? So from on campus, we're not requiring MFA for Office 365 at this time. So this is something that you'd see when you were off campus, more than anything else. So we hope that you find this useful. I think this is a great way to try this out, get acquainted with it. I mean, if nothing else, you can get your device set up in MFA, in Azure MFA, so you can use that going forward. So when this does become a requirement at a later point, you'll be able to just move forward and jump right into it. You won't have any other setup to do. All right, so I've saved a special nerdy treat for our last demonstration here, and I hope you enjoy this. The audience of this demonstration is more application developers or application administrators, or people that build applications that other UNM folks need to log into and access. So Azure Active Directory makes this process very easy. I mean, it's a lot easier on our side, and we think it's pretty easy on the application administrator side as well. So as I discussed before, Azure AD supports both SAML, it's really SAML 2, and OpenID Connect for application authentication. So if your application supports either one of these protocols, integrating it with Azure AD is very easy. And once it's integrated with Azure AD, then we have the ability to very easily apply Azure MFA to your application as needed. So there are a couple of types of apps. There are what we call gallery applications in Azure AD, and most mainstream vendors, people like Salesforce, SAP, Cornerstone on Demand, vendors like that actually have these pre-built gallery apps in Azure AD, and those are basically just templates that we can deploy in Azure AD, add a couple details, and then the application is integrated with Azure AD at that point. So that's a pretty easy and straightforward process, and wherever possible, we try and do that. In this demo, we're actually going to look at onboarding a custom or a non-gallery application. And for things that are built in-house, they'll probably always roll up under that category. And if it's a vendor that we're using that maybe doesn't have a gallery app, that'll roll up under the category as well. So we're going to use SAML for our onboarding example here. And Usually this is just a matter of exchanging metadata. We give the vendor our metadata, they give us theirs. You tell us what claims or attributes from the directory you need. That could be things like, user's first name, their last name, their banner ID, their affiliation, things like that. You just let us know what those are. We'll configure those in Azure AD, and then when someone authenticates to your application, Azure AD will both authenticate them and release whatever attributes those are, so your application can consume and make other authorization decisions based on that. So let's jump into this and take a look at the process here. And there's actually an Azure AD authentication or authorization thing we'll talk about. So here's the Azure AD interface. It's very straightforward. We just add a new app. We chose non-gallery application. We're going to go ahead and call this app the best app ever. So this is pretty quick. As you can see, Azure AD has already added this application. So first we're going to set a couple properties here. And this is where we're going to get into our little authorization discussion. So I'm going to pause here. This user assignment required, this is turned on by default. And it's actually a really neat thing. What this lets you do is within Azure Active Directory itself, we can assign AD groups to your application, and Azure Active Directory will only let the members of those groups authenticate to your app. So in this way, you can offload both authentication and authorization to Azure Active Directory, which is really cool. This would be ideal if you don't want to spend a lot of time developing authorization logic within your application, or if you have some other reason why you want to just handle authorization on the front end and not really deal with it in your app. So I'm going to turn that setting off for this demo, but this is actually a really neat feature to consider if your application already does some sort of authorization using Active Directory. You might be able to do this and get rid of a direct bind, for example. The other thing we'll talk about is this visible to users, which I'm also going to turn off. But this is a useful thing if you want to make your application visible to people when they go to myapps.microsoft.com. So again, I'm going to turn both of these off for this demo, but these are things that are useful and worth considering. The last thing we're going to do is just copy the application URL because we're going to use that later to log in. So we'll save our changes there. Now let's move on to the single sign-on config. So this is pretty straightforward. We're just going to choose SAML here. And again, OpenID Connect is also an option. And this is where we would import the metadata that you give us. So here I have some sample metadata. So I'm going to go ahead and just download this so I can upload it into Azure AD. And this is the metadata for the best app ever, if you will. This is the SP metadata. So as an app owner, you'd normally provide us with this. So all right, I've downloaded the file. I'm going to go ahead and upload it into Azure Active Directory. Go ahead and open that, and click add. And so Azure AD is going to pull in some of the key information we need here, like the relying party identifier, reply URL, and things of that nature. So since I've done this before, I actually have a duplicate entity ID here. So we're just going to add a test to the end of it to make that unique. And we'll click save, and we should be good to go. And then we can also provide things like relay state, things of that nature if your application requires that. So now that we've got the basic SAML configuration done, we're going to go and look at some of our claims. So let's go ahead and close that out. By default, user attributes and claims, Azure AD will send these things. It'll send email, given name, first name, and last name. So let's add another claim here. We're just going to add a custom member of claim so that we're sending your application the AD groups that someone's a member of. So we'll choose SAM account name for the attribute of the group we're sending. We're going to rename the attribute to member of, and we'll go ahead and do save. So there's the list of claims we're going to send the best app ever. So now let's have a test here. We're going to go ahead and log into the best app ever. So we'll paste the login URL that we captured in the previous step. Go ahead and log in with our NetID and password here. We can go ahead and do our password in this step. Sorry about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. And choose accordingly here. And so this should take us into the best app ever. And what this app does is it basically just shows the claims that have been released by the identity provider. So you can see it's released my email address, it's released my first name and last name. Let's see what else we have here. There's some other claims. Yeah, there's the given name claim. So that we're sending over. You saw that in Azure AD. We're sending the email address as noted. There's last name or surname. And then here's that custom member of attribute we created. So that's a list of all the Active Directory groups that the user that logged in is a member of. So as you can see, I mean, this is pretty quick. In a matter of minutes, we've been able to onboard a new application into Azure AD. This was previously a lot more complicated. It was a lot more complicated to customize claims. Now that's a very easy process. So it's pretty smooth, pretty frictionless. We hope that this helps application developers and application administrators if you're requesting authentication or authorization for your app, please consider using Azure AD because that's definitely the direction we're moving. And I think there's a lot of value here and a lot of neat functionality. All right, so hopefully we all made it. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time and attention and for watching this. I hope you found that it was valuable and at least gave you a little insight into our plans for single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, and hopefully got you excited about some of the improvements that are coming down the pipe soon. So, if you have questions, go ahead and leave a comment on this video, and I'll do my best to answer those as they come in. So thank you guys so much.